Anyway, the seminars organize around themes under the Bologna Institute for Policy Research. And what's very important is that it's very interdisciplinary. And I think that's something that's very important for you, because we have decided purposely to only have these seminars on Mondays and Thursdays, so that essentially everybody can attend. There's going to be a few conflicts here and there, but in general, so that anybody can go to them. Last thing we want is to have just, you know, economic seminars where the people that are more economically inclined go to, and the Middle East seminars with only people interested in the Middle East go to. The idea of this is to promote interdisciplinary approaches to issues. And so today we're going to hear about transatlantic relations, but I do hope we have a lot of people who are working on the Middle East and Europe here, because this is what it's supposed to be about. It's not just about, when you're at SAIS, it's not just about what you learn in the classroom, but also what you learn outside the classroom. And the Bologna Institute of Policy Research seminar series here is really an integral part of this experience here. So we try to avoid conflicts as much as possible. You won't see a lot of these things during exam week, unless we have to be opportunistic, somebody's coming through. So hopefully everybody's going to be able to make it in the future. So without further ado, let me hand it over to the floor over to Professor Michael Lee to introduce our guest today. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Plummer, for those words of welcome. Greetings to everybody to this first session of our seminar series, the first session of the semester. And there couldn't be a more timely theme or a better speaker to address it than transatlantic relations under Biden, opportunities and challenges. SAIS is a transatlantic school by definition, so we are inevitably focusing on issues involved in the transatlantic relationship, and there have been plenty of these issues, as you'll all be aware, in the last few weeks. And up to today, actually, when I rejoiced to see that the US restriction on European travelers to the United States is about to be lifted, which I can't help feeling is no coincidence, the timing at least, in light of certain other developments that we'll be discussing here this evening. Ambassador Veronika Wand-Danielsson is extremely well placed to discuss transatlantic relations, having been her country's ambassador to NATO and her country's ambassador to France, and also having served in Brussels, both in the EU institutions and in the Swedish representation to the European Union, and in a number of other diplomatic posts throughout her career. And she's going to speak to us this evening for about 20 minutes on the subject, and then we'll have an exchange of views. Before we get started, for those of you who are following this online, please put your questions into the QA function, not the chat function, and I'll keep my eye on your questions and filter them into our discussion as we go along. Ambassador Wand-Danielsson, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Michael. And I just realized the complexity. As I told some of you, I just had a session with very nice students discussing feminist foreign policy, that I haven't worn a mask for quite some time. So that's also a first. And I'm just looking now, the challenge to have the mask and the glass of water. I think I'm going to skip the water.
You want to remember you've got the mask on.
Absolutely, going to be pouring it down. Just to say, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you. And it's your first evening. It's your first day back, I understand as well. So I'm grateful for the number of students that are here. I was just telling Michael, why aren't they sitting on now it's getting cold in Sweden already. Why aren't you on a lovely terrace, sipping a glass of nice Italian wine, than listening to me speaking about the transatlantic bumpy relationship? Anyway, it's a pleasure, it's an honor, it's a privilege to address the students of SAIS Europe. and being invited to give this opening lecture of the new academic year. And this time, not only, that was the occasion I had last year, a virtual presentation, but actually in real life. What a treat. A warm thank you, therefore, both to the director of Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, Mike Plummer, and to you, dear Michael, for your trust and your interest. And of course, to all of you for your interest and curiosity. Few things could be more pertinent these days than to address the challenges and opportunities of transatlantic relations in the tumultuous year of 2021. As we are undertaking on both sides of the Atlantic, historic efforts to address a myriad of global challenges, ranging from preventing the spread of COVID-19, fighting climate change, to undertaking dramatic evacuation measures in Afghanistan. The need for unity, coordination, and cooperation among partners becomes evident. This is indeed a crucial reminder of the fact that the Atlantic Ocean that separates Europe from the US does not divide our two continents. Instead, it binds us together at so many levels. I will address some of them here today with you, and what an excellent place to have this conversation. It was the insight regarding the geopolitical necessity of establishing transatlantic unity between Europe and the US that underpinned the very foundation of SAIS in Bologna, formed in 1955 by Professor Grove Haynes and his colleagues. Back then, Europe was still gradually recovering from the horrors of two devastating world wars, while simultaneously observing the contours of what Churchill a few years earlier had described as the Iron Curtain, spreading across the European continent. A lot has happened these past 60 years. Let me, however, not only fast forward, but also try to describe the transatlantic relationship from a mid-sized European country's perspective, namely my own, Sweden. Sweden and the US share a deep, multifaceted bilateral bond. For Sweden, and I would say actually for all Nordic countries, the US is and remains an invaluable and instrumental partner at so many different levels. Around I told you I would fast forward, I'll fast backwards first. Around 1850, when Sweden was a poor agricultural country, we experienced a massive migration of Swedes to the US looking for a better life. More than 1.5 million people migrated. In those days, a fifth of the Swedish population, thereby already creating ties and bonds throughout the US that actually last until today. In 2021, it is our economic and trade ties that are important, but also our security and defense cooperation. The US is indeed today Sweden's biggest export market outside Europe, and the US remains the single biggest market for Swedish direct investments. When I took over this posting last autumn, I was amazed to see that we're even the 13th biggest foreign investor in the US before countries like Italy, we're in Italy now, or Brazil or South Korea. And Sweden is not alone in that position in Europe. The European Union as a whole and the United States have the largest bilateral trade and investment relationship and enjoy the most integrated economic relationship in the world. Transatlantic trade amounts to more than 40% of world GDP and more than 40% of global trade in goods and services. Transatlantic unity has also been and remains paramount when defending the rules-based international order in the multilateral forums built together since World War II. So safeguarding, for instance, the European security order continues to guide Sweden's present OSCE chairmanship. My foreign minister is until the end of the year, is the chairman of the OECD for this year, and safeguarding the OSCE with everything that is going on in the East is a key priority for her and for us. And transatlantic unity is key, not the least, regarding security and defense-related matters. We have seen more challenging as well as stable periods in Europe these past 60 years, from the Cold War period to a slight detente, I would allow myself to say it, in the 90s, which then actually kicked off a period of major NATO-led international crisis management operations, and not always so international, starting in the Balkans, in fact, Bosnia, Kosovo, and then Afghanistan, 20 years intervention in Afghanistan, including the shorter intermezzo in Libya as well. Sweden, as a non-allied country and not a member of NATO, participated and contributed actively to all NATO-led operations. Today, I may say, Sweden finds itself again in a more insecure and unstable geopolitical environment, in particular as regards our eastern and northern neighborhood. In the Baltic Sea area and in the eastern neighborhood, we are witnessing a more strategically assertive and tactically opportunistic behavior from Russia. The security situation is unlikely to improve. This is our assessment as well as the assessment of our neighbors. And we therefore need and work towards the reinforcement of a close transatlantic security partnership. This explains that further to our strong economic and trade ties, which I mentioned, the defense and security agenda is probably the most important aspect of the Swedish-US bilateral relationship, perhaps despite or perhaps even because we're not members of NATO. Actively engaging with Washington is therefore viewed as essential for any Swedish government, disregarding party political affiliations. It is ultimately viewed as essential for safeguarding the prosperity and security of our citizens. The need for such dynamic cooperation is frequently displayed not only in the rhetoric, but also in practice. Let me give you an example. A powerful example is, in fact, such undertakings could be showcased in this unique intelligence cooperation between the FBI and the Swedish police this year, jointly spearheading the multinational law enforcement campaign, Operation Trojan Shield. This coordination campaign between Stockholm and Washington successfully disrupted organized crime activities across the globe and prevented the loss of life at an unparalleled scale. Another landmark example of our mutual dependence can be illustrated when studying the depth and sophistication, indeed, of the interoperability between our armed forces. It has been gradually built up during the past 20 years, cooperating side by side in the various crisis management operations in which we both served over the years. It is today, for instance, a prerequisite for ongoing peacekeeping efforts, even in Mali, even though the US is not directly part of the different missions in Mali. But it's also a prerequisite for a deepened defense cooperation in Northern Europe, with the Americans bilaterally, but also with our regional neighbors in the north. Indeed, another example, last week only, hundreds of Swedish and US Marines were training side by side, fighting shoulder to shoulder during the exercise Archipelago Endeavor 2021. The rigor and the unique composition of such defense coordination measures during an exercise was underlined by General Christopher Cavoli, commander of the US Army Europe and Africa, who visited Stockholm in July this year to oversee also the transfer of a new Patriot air defense system, which soon will become operational in Sweden. Enough now of the defense agenda, and some of you might want to come back to it. You hear that I've spent 7 years at NATO. Let me now move to the European level and say a few words about the new EU-US Common Agenda for Global Change. Many Swedish bilateral priorities, and therefore we did not go through all the bilateral issues because otherwise I would have to repeat them coming to the EU agenda. Our relations with the US in terms of other bilateral priorities than the economic ties and the defense ties are reflected in common priorities, indeed established now in Brussels in a common global agenda with the Americans. Following the election of President Biden in November last year, the European Commission and the External Action Service swiftly commenced work during last autumn to produce a new common package of proposals for a reinforced transatlantic cooperation. The proposal put forward by the Council and the Commission is called a new EU-US Agenda for Global Change. It encompasses 4 main areas on which our partnership is expected to focus. First, understandably, strengthening global public health and working together on the vaccines and seeing together that the vaccines will be made available throughout the world and not only our 2 continents. The second issue, main theme, and will be a package on which we'll be working, of course, in the long run, is combating climate change. And that's, of course, a very high priority on the Swedish agenda. And then the third theme of cooperation will be around enhancing trade and technology, in particular, green trade. And fourthly, defending and promoting democratic values. Our cooperation, the EU-US cooperation, is firmly anchored on shared values. At the EU-US summit in June, both parties agreed to establish a new platform for cooperation, the Trade and Technology Council. It has not existed before. It will be launched in a few weeks' time, in 10 days' time, actually, in Pittsburgh. The aim of this council is to facilitate bilateral trade and investment and to deepen, not the least, transatlantic regulatory cooperation. As I said, it will be a first inaugural meeting now in Pittsburgh in only 10 days. And you can imagine, for a free, trade-minded, and export-dependent nation such as Sweden, this new transatlantic agenda is, of course, very good news. The potential of this new trade council is high, both in terms of economic output and achieving strategically important progress. We want to see it increasing cooperation on technology, on developing, not the least, compatible international standards, and creating, for instance, if possible, a common digital rules book. These are, from Sweden's perspective, the most important commitments on the agenda. We see that they would greatly strengthen transatlantic competitiveness, as well as our industrial leadership. And these are areas of cooperation requested also by the Swedish industry. As one of the leading 5G tech countries in the world, with the Swedish company Ericsson, one of the 2 5G providers outside of Asia, Sweden is strongly committed to ensuring that the future standards for new technologies will be developed jointly between the EU and the US. In other words, with countries sharing democratic values, and thereby function also as a defense of open societies and open democracies, also at global level, rather than enabling a further increase in digital authoritarianism. As the convergence also between trade and security continues to grow, it is thus crucial that the EU and the US make the most out of the EU-US Trade and Technology Committee that has a great role to play here. There are, however, 2 other crucial themes underpinning the transatlantic relationship: promoting and defending democracy, and working together in jointly addressing climate change. Sweden has warmly welcomed President Biden's timely initiative to convene the Summit for Democracy in December in Washington, and strongly commits itself to make it a successful endeavor. We look forward to partnering with the United States in defense of democracy throughout the world. The growth of recent years of authoritarian regimes makes it paramount in our view that democracies come together and collectively demonstrate that democracy is and remains the best way to promote and protect the rights and the well-being of all its citizens. We need to stand up for our shared values, advance our shared interest, and demonstrate that democracy can deliver even in the face of new accelerating global changes. Another important priority on the EU's agenda is addressing climate change and biodiversity, with the main focus on cutting emissions while seeking to promote green growth and working towards net zero emissions, inshallah, by 2050. Present transatlantic efforts are focusing on ambitious global agreements at next year's UN summits on climate and biodiversity. I have so far now provided you with a number of the numerous opportunities that Sweden sees in a strong transatlantic tie, both for itself at national level and of course at EU level. But I was also asked to talk about the challenges. Look, he's looking forward to that part. Isn't that interesting? Yes. And I can tell you, and you will know that already yourself, they are numerous. They're ultimately, I would however say, about mutual trust and confidence. But they're also, more importantly, about how the EU and the US view themselves or their ability to meet future opportunities and challenges. Is it through isolationism, through protectionism and closed borders, or rather through a global rules-based free trade order and strengthened international cooperation? Do we think that we can best solve our national economic and security interests alone, or rather in partnership with other European countries or other leading democracies in the world, not the least the United States of America? In both the US, but also in Europe, countries and citizens find different answers to these fundamental questions. The past troublesome 4 years under the Trump administration led to well-known and partly understandable rift between the EU and the US. With the Biden administration, at least for my country, new hope has emerged, but the honeymoon was perhaps a bit shorter than expected. The ill-planned exit from Afghanistan was a certain wake-up call. And these last few days, the announcement of a new AUKUS agreement between the US, Australia, and the UK dominates, of course, the news and has led to very strong reactions, not the least in the country I served in the past 6 years, namely France. I would say we come back, I will listen to your questions, we can come back to that as a subject in itself under the QA session. So I will not say more on that, and actually it's very early days. But from Sweden's perspective, disregarding those two now very challenging, very quickly developments only this past month, I was in fact on holiday when all of Afghanistan blew up. And you can imagine, having spent 7 years at NATO working on that particular mission, the ISAF mission, it came as rather a shock. Despite those challenges, bumps in the road, call it what you want, from my country's perspective, a transatlantic link, not the least the transatlantic security link, remains crucial also post-Afghanistan. We should, for instance, seek to counter the flawed and somehow misleading narrative, which quickly came up, about the US departure from Afghanistan as an indication of that Washington is somehow unable or unwilling to fulfill its security commitments in Europe. The European-US defense cooperation through NATO remains the most operational, capable, economically potent, and strategically agile partnership in the world. That is still a fact today. Tendencies towards isolationism on both sides must therefore, in our view, be avoided. Ongoing discussions in the EU, in certain EU capitals in particular, about the need for Europe to develop a strategic autonomy are, in our view, in Stockholm's view, most unhelpful and risk further triggering already existing isolationist tendencies also in Washington. The transatlantic interdependency was indeed even highlighted, in fact, during the dramatic evacuation efforts in Afghanistan. All EU countries were dependent on the US to effectively coordinate our consular quick response efforts, sharing imminent threat assessments among our intelligence agencies, and using best practice among our first responders to just save lives at Kabul airport when terror strikes against civilians. It is also worthwhile remembering, noting that the US Ramstein Air Base in Germany, where thousands of Afghans were flown every day during the evacuation, is still today the largest American military base in the world outside of US national territory. So to those scholars, also among you, suggesting that the US is slowly reducing its footprint in Europe in order to build up both political focus and strategic deterrence towards China, it is worth remembering that many of the diplomatic platforms for such endeavors remain distinctly centered around Europe, wanting to work with Europe, also on those challenges further east. It is, for instance, in the Arctic, where Russian and Chinese spheres of influence intersect directly with US national interest. The commercial opportunities related to developing new game-changing transportation routes in the high north makes not the least Nordic US cooperation indispensable for decades to come. Sweden and Finland remain also for the US the leading technological innovation hubs for discussions on 5G. So taking into account not the least the enormous challenges posed by a growing and assertive China, transatlantic unity remains the only alternative, if not the only game in town, and this for the foreseeable future. Thank you for your attention, Professor, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Veronika, for that overview of transatlantic relations, both the opportunities and the challenges, and Sweden's particular place in this relationship. I'd like to remind the participants, particularly those online, that they're invited to put their questions using the QA function. For those of you here, if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand and identify yourself, and then pose your question to Veronika. Who would like to begin? Yes, please. Just 1 second.
Good.
Good evening. My name is Amanda, and thank you so much, Ambassador, for joining us tonight. My question is, if I have my history correct, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe Sweden was one of the first countries to adopt a formalized feminist foreign policy. And I was wondering, for those in the U.S. who are, trying to have this adopted as well, if you had any thoughts, if the feminist foreign policy in the U.S. would have any difference with some of the challenges that we're facing today, if it can contribute to that need to strengthen mutual trust, and any advice that you might have for those working on it in the U.S.
Good question. I will take them one by one, exactly. And sitting with a few of your students, colleagues, just an hour ago, this was one of the discussions we were having then as well. And I would say the Biden administration, Biden/Harris, that's already, for us, an important symbol that you have a woman vice president. If we talk about feminist foreign policies, we had, I think I even mentioned this the hour before, only 2 weeks ago, my Minister of Development had 1.5 hours talk with Samantha Power, now heading USAID. And she put basically the same question as you did, and said, I'm fascinated about the Swedish feminist foreign policy. We have a manual for those particularly interested. Ladies and gentlemen, you can download the manual of feminist foreign policy. It has some operational tools, how to work with it, particularly when you work, let's say, in international relations and agencies or ministries. To become even more concrete, how can you apply it? I will not sort of quote the whole detail of what her response was, but I would say she basically said we stand fully behind that approach. This is one of my own personal commitments, but also from the president and downwards. And you just look at the appointments from Secretary of State Blinken, Jake Sullivan, they're very European minded and they're very equal opportunity minded. And you would say those values you try to pursue, and not only in your country, but at global level, you can count us in. We will now be focusing on certain projects in Central America. And we're looking at certain co-projects, Swedish, American projects. We will not necessarily call them feminist foreign policy. That's where I felt a reluctance of using a terminology which she thought will need more time to not, to avoid unnecessary discussions around the terminology, but rather getting on with the work and looking at the tools book we had and seeing whether we could do something together around that. But we felt, my minister in particular, I was the one listening in only, interest, commitment, putting resources to the mouth. I think we also talked about the 3 R's, not to go into the whole seminar on feminist foreign policy, but the 3 main principles when we talk about that concept, and I think it was actually the lecture of last year, the 3 R's, the first is rights, seeing to that every country in the world has rights and lives up to the convention, which allow equal opportunity and respect for women, giving women the same rights as men, basically, which sum it down. The second is representativity, representation. Every woman should sit wherever, if she's a student, if she's in the family, at the workplace, in school, in class, a woman should sit at the table where a decision is taken that will influence her work, her life. And that implies you have to be represented at the table where decisions are taken. If it's a private sector, public sector, be at the table. And it's actually, we also had a discussion with your group of students a little bit earlier. Now we say women and men. Sexual orientation doesn't play a role. It's the equal right, disregarding your orientations, disregarding your ethnic background. You should sit at the table and defend and influence and shape the decisions will at some point will affect you. That's the second R. And resources, very quickly. In certain situations, it implies extra resources to give that ability for women to be part of the discussion, to be part of taking the example of sports club. Soccer is very popular in Sweden now among young girls, but many clubs came back and said, okay, we open up for girls soccer, but then we don't have the rooms, the vestiaire to change and the women's toilets or places where you can change. So therefore we cannot open up our club. So every commune gets extra money to make the facilitate the inclusion of young girls for that sport art. So in certain cases, just as an example, you need extra funds to make, let's say, equal opportunity possible. Therefore, the last R is so important. So yes, I think with this administration, to sort of summarize your question, we will have strong support working together at every level. And if certain countries, I also made that point clear, it's easier in a country which has come very far in terms of women's rights to come with a concept like feminism or feminist government or feminist foreign policy. I even admitted, and I think maybe did that last year, when I heard the concept 2014, we had a new prime minister and our foreign minister was the person behind that, that drive, wanted him to stand up and say, I represent now, I'm the prime minister of a feminist government, which didn't imply that everybody were women, but basically this is what we stand for. We have to integrate that dimension in all aspects of our society, our economics. I sat as ambassador newly appointed in Paris. I allowed myself to say, quite a conservative country, a fabulous country, and I thought, going around saying I represent a feminist government, and I'm a woman, by the way, can easily sort of, be marked. And I had, of course, many smiles. Oh, l'ambassadeur de Suède, oh, feminist, oh, can you please explain? And I thought, no, that was not really necessary. I can defend women's rights, but do I have to have that sort of terminology? 4 years, I think I mentioned that example. 5 years later, I attended a UNESCO conference in Paris, 4 years later. The whole room filled with nationalities from around the world. The main title of this conference were How to Promote Feminist Foreign Policy Throughout the World. Many Americans, many Canadians, they were the driving forces, NGOs, think tanks. I've been amazed to see the women's groups, not only in the States, in Africa, in Latin America, strong women's groups where these concepts now are taken for granted. And where I had to go back and said, Veronika, you're a bit old-fashioned. maybe you should modernize a bit. And today, you know, you live with the concept and you endorse it, you accept it, and you see that you actually can change even, let's say, your preconceived perceptions on a term, which might still therefore be the case in certain environments in the States. But as long as you go on with the work, the name can come later. We got a bit of feminist foreign policy now for free.
Yeah, no, that's. Please feel free to ask questions across the whole range of issues, whether career issues, career in diplomacy, feminist foreign policy, transatlantic relationships. In Veronika's role with NATO, she was a very frequent visitor to Afghanistan, the issues posed by Afghanistan, or any other issues on your mind. Who would like to ask another question? The Master of Arts of International Affairs.
And you're français. Ah, mais parlons pas français. Je sais pas. Les autres entendront pas. No, I think we have to stick. Now, what could you be asking about? What do you think? Could it be Caucasus?
Could everybody hear the question?
What was my reaction about the arms deal that the Australians broke to enter into a new cooperation? Right. That's getting more tricky. You see what happens in politics, and I'm a bit of a too passionate person. That's maybe one of my big defaults. But I think I love politics, and I get very engaged and committed in, you know, the subjects I deal with, including Afghanistan. And then you bleed when things go the wrong way. But what you also learn with time, you take a step back, you breathe deeply, and with a certain distance, things start, like in everything in life, from your personal life to, you get a different perspective. And yes, let's start with knowing France. I'm not French, but I'm partly French in my heart. I went to French school. I did my master's at Sciences Po. And yes, I spent 3 years and now 6 years in France. I understand the French way of thinking, and I can still be a Swedish diplomat observing it and also feeling where we differ, and we do differ on many levels. Even though now I go back to Stockholm, they say, "Oh, she's become too French. You can hardly have a work here anymore." I can understand the upsetness, definitely, the way it was a little bit. And actually, we talked about it, of course, these past half day that we've met. It reminded me a bit of Afghanistan, the handling of the exit, which I still, knowing the scenery, I traveled twice a year to Afghanistan for 7 years. I saw the developments, I saw the improvements. I saw Kabul. The last time I went was summer 2014, and the first time 27. And 27, I was sort of an armed vehicle, military convoy, and this was basically all of Afghanistan still. And 2014, it was a different scenario. Girls, it looked like an Indian town. Yes, you still have IEDs blowing up. But anyway, I'm not going to go to we can get a separate question on that. But now looking at the outcast, what has happened these past few days, I'm less surprised. Let's say I understand the French frustration, upsetness. Then maybe one shouldn't go too high up in terms of anger, because at some point you have to climb down again. But understandable. Of course, I think my government would have been extremely upset in such a similar situation. But then I also, and this I say just looking at the situation, understand, I know because I have a strong military knowledge, and know how close the Five Eyes system, which is a very far-reaching intelligent cooperation among 5 countries, and the closest are the Australians, the Americans, the Brits, the Canadians. In fact, they could also say, "Oh, we want to be part of that." It's more surprising that the Australians in 16 decided to go to accept the French offer. And actually, you speak to a Swedish ambassador. I have sat at least 2 meetings with my defense minister at NATO headquarters, doing an ISAF meeting, in a separate meeting with the Australian defense minister, because guess what? The submarines today, the Australian submarines today are Swedish submarines. We produce our own submarines, and we were bidding for the same offer that they gave. It would even have made more sense to upgrade our system. It would have been cheaper for them. Our planes are a bit cheaper, in case you want, questioning. I mean, it's part of the job.
Would you like to sign? We have a contract.
But we lost the bid. Japan was bidding, we were bidding on that same contract. French is an excellent defense industry. They got the bid. And of course, the calculation on the Australian side, not difficult to understand from us, even though we wanted to be able to expand our interest in defense procurement contracts with Asia. But France is a power in the Pacific. It has its interest. It has, I think it's 6,000 to 8,000 soldiers in the region, Marines in the region. It has its dom-tom. So from an Australian, it's more interesting to have a major European power than a mid-sized European country, which basically has a commercial interest, and at that point couldn't offer much more than a good, a good bilateral relationship. But I think the geopolitical situation, which you also know in 2016, was an American administration, a Trump factor. I think had it not been, and now of course I'm speculating, I'm speaking freely and just giving you my personal advice, and we haven't, it's too early to make in-depth sort of assessments, but I would assume had it been another American administration, probably the contract wouldn't have gone to the French in the first place. It would have been more logical for military reasons, for intelligence sharing reasons, because the great power that all this is about China, which hasn't been discussed so much in the papers. It's all about breaking contracts. I think the more interesting discussions would be how do we address the challenges that China poses? We have economic interests, we have partnerships with China, but we have certain behaviors we cannot accept because they go counter to our own democratic values. And if the US is a more serious or a stronger political and defense partnership for Australia, and they already have this deep cooperation, and then you have the UK who's just left the EU and has been very open from the outset, from the Brexit outset. Our ambitions remain global. We don't want to be tied to, let's say, European constraints. It's understandable that they would be part of that cooperation. They're already part of these Five Eyes. So I understand the objectives. I think the timing was lousy. And this is, again, that's my personal commitment. I was mentioning to you, we've been working, one of the heavyweights in the EU-US relations is economic cooperation, is trade, is now looking at, with a new regulatory cooperation, the agenda is enormous. It's digitalization of our economies, is seeing to that we move in the same direction, that we have standards that sort of correspond. Our companies, we're an export-oriented country. If they have to have separate standards for the American market, the second biggest market after Europe, it's a cost for companies, it's a cost for the country. So if we can develop new standards on new technology and a greener trade that we can promote, and we have many companies now in this whole transition towards greener trade, green transition of our companies. If we can develop those new standards together, it's to the benefit of the US, their markets, and because they can with their products and enter the European market more easily. So we have this big economic agenda. And it therefore is, and Pittsburgh, as I mentioned, the inaugural meeting is next week, I think I remember correctly. One of the two most important commissioners, Vestager is going there, and Dobrovsky, Commissioner of Trade, and meeting Raimunda, the new Secretary of Trade, and Blinken. Tony Blinken will open this meeting. This was supposed to be the first sort of positive outcome after the summit, which was in June, which was very short, and then came this agenda. And of course, how fun is it? It's not going to be easy for the Commission or for the Americans, knowing that one of the key European countries that breaks now that the UK has left is France, and France is pissed off, and we can understand it. And that will have, unfortunately, a negative effect on an agenda which actually serves the interests of France as well. France needs the economic agenda, needs the trade agenda. It's a big export-oriented country, and the US is a big market for France. So the timing is unfortunate. The way it was handled there by the comparison with Afghanistan, I can understand after 20 years, at some point, when the support of the population is not there for a big crisis management intervention, and Trump had been clear, set the timetable, but I've met President Biden as vice president at NATO, and this was 2011. He was then already clear on that he was not a big supporter of the surge that then happened those years, the military surge, that he didn't see a possibility to to remain for such a long period in Afghanistan. So he was critical for a long time. But the way the exit was handled was unfortunate for our relationships across the Atlantic. And knowing, just looking at my own minister, my own government, the enormous, after 4 tough years, it has been not easy, particularly when you're a very value-based country. At the end of the day, we have done a lot with the Americans also these past 4 years, not the least on hardcore security. They have delivered. Many people sometimes wonder, well, how could you work with the Trump administration? Well, we could. We're quite pragmatic, and they continue delivering, and we delivered our commitments. So there was a lot of talk, but of course it's not only easy. Now comes a new, more value-based, more sort of social democratic oriented Biden government who talks like us, he speaks like us, has the same priorities, democracy, climate, fighting climate change. And you want to continue on that positive note. And if one big EU country is affected, it will affect the Stimmung in the EU as such. And that's, but then again, as I said, we were in the middle of Afghanistan crisis when AUKUS came. Now Afghanistan is, now that's old news. And that's where I meant, you have to let some time go, se dégonfler un petit peu, and then continue working towards a common positive agenda. And there are many, as I mentioned, many positive items on that agenda.
Veronika, we have a question from one of our participants online, former US Senator Gordon Humphrey, who asks, in light of the serious humanitarian crisis facing Afghanistan, whether addressing this crisis could be the subject of transatlantic cooperation, and also whether it could be the occasion to cooperate constructively with Russia.
On Afghanistan?
Yeah. Humanitarian.
Yes, absolutely. That is what we're focusing on right now, actually. There is a lot of work and talk going on. Also to mention, it was not easy for Sweden. We have been involved in humanitarian support to Afghanistan during the Taliban period, the first Taliban period already. So Sweden had several NGOs, but mainly working on schooling and education and health and providing support to hospitals. So it was therefore easy for us to jump into and become part of the ISAF mission. And when the military surge occurred, particularly in 2011, there was, including strong American pressure, to actually increase strongly our development assistance further. So today, in 2021, Afghanistan is the main recipient country of Swedish development aid. Because we felt we had the strong security engagement, but there is no military solution to Afghanistan. Most of the US military would have said that for ages already, but we didn't put enough effort the first. That will still be my main criticism. I personally belong to those who thought we could have stayed a bit longer. I know the Americans made another judgment, but I think we came in very late with development support. And it was conducted like a military operation for the first 10 years. Even the EU was hardly present. Yes, Italy did some police support, Germany some police support, but the aid, the development cooperation came very late. And 10 years in development cooperation terms is a very short period. Don't forget that. So I think we could probably have done better and more in the longer run. But now things are as they are, but it takes time to downsize. We have, in many countries in Europe, have that commitment. A lot of aid going to Afghanistan. How do we work with that development aid? And we were working with the United Nations. I think that's perhaps the best way to, because you can work with the UNHCR and World Food Program and other humanitarian oriented actors to get aid into the country. Because my government has made a very strong commitment to say no aid should go to the Taliban if they haven't lived up to certain conditions. And talk about feminist foreign policy. I think the Taliban are quite far away from that policy. But we want to see that they are assured the same rights before we can accept to give macro financial assistance or really work with them as you would with other countries. So yes, I think we can do a lot on the humanitarian side. Maybe, yes, maybe even we want to have a constructive agenda, despite all I said in terms of our threat assessment is not necessarily shared with all European countries on Russia. But Afghanistan, I worked a lot with the Russian delegation. We sat in the same building, called Manfred Wörner building at NATO headquarters. And they had a very flamboyant ambassador, Dmitry Rogozin, who then became deputy prime minister. He made a better career than I did. But you see, I'm not giving you the straight answer because it's complicated. On certain terms, I know when NATO was already discussing, when the first NATO decision to draw down on sort of the hardcore military part, and they would start the training mission, would start in 2014. So the fighting component was ended in 2014. You would give support to the Afghan security forces to basically secure the country themselves. The Russians were big defenders and wanted to convince the Americans and NATO to stay, because of course for them it was a security risk for their own country, their own region. At the same time, it was always, I think, ambiguous, because they didn't want the Americans to be successful or NATO to be successful, because that's bad for Russia in more general terms. At the same time, they had the worry of Islamism spreading and pouring into their country, and they didn't want to have Taliban affecting their own border areas, border regions. So I think the full trust they allowed, you could fly through the Russian airspace, you could actually use Russia's space to get in your equipment, etc., everything you needed during the mission. But I think it was the tactics changed. So I think it was not the full trustful cooperation. Maybe they can be helpful. I mean, they've been quite courageous now, saying we will stay, we will open up an embassy. If that's a way to influence that, if that's what it takes to influence the Chinese, by the way, also. They've also proclaimed that they will, and mines they can exploit, maybe trying to improve the income for Afghanistan. So I think we'll probably have a pragmatic approach to talking and working with them, if that's what it takes to be able to support the people and the women and the children. That will be our main goal, if we can work indirectly. On va voir.
Thank you, Veronika. We have some questions online. I also have some questions, but I'd like to give a chance now to someone in the room who would like to follow up. Yes, at the back.
Hi, my name's Adele and I'm from India. So India, the US are part of the Quad. I was wondering if Sweden was considering joining or creating a partnership due to China's ambition of the Polar Silk Road. And would, as of now, it's unfeasible, but with climate change, it could be possible. And would Sweden view the Polar Silk Road as a threat or a benefit?
The last was Sweden view what?
The Silk Road.
The Polar Silk Road.
Polar Silk Road.
Yeah. Clever.
Yeah. Perhaps I'd just add to that, as you did say polar, so okay. Let me just add to that a question from somebody online who is asking how will the EU and the US address the Arctic issue together and face the challenge from China and Russia in the Arctic? So it's a back-to-back kind of question.
Yeah. I mean, it's part of also the agenda when we talk about the transatlantic relationship, the added value of Europe, which was questioned these past 4 years, where we thought it was particularly rewarding to hear President Biden and Secretary Blinken reaffirm the strong mutual dependency of working together. The US does not want to be alone facing China, and if it's a value-based approach or value-based, their position they're taking are on the same values we share. It is better, it is easier if they can work in an alliance with democracies. And Europe, this is our position, we share the same view. We want to work together, we want to have a pragmatic approach to China. When we can work, when they respect the international rules and obligations, we can work and they can work under the framework of the WTO. We will work pragmatically with China as well. It's when we feel that they start using other criteria and other methods that we will have difficulties. So we need to work together, and I think the Americans need Europe and Europe needs the American. Europe alone, which sometimes when we talk about the strategic autonomy raised by certain capitals stronger than others, not pointing out anyone here today, but we question even the possibility of Europe facing alone China on such issues, for instance. We need to have stronger alliances. The Silk Road itself, Polar Silk Road, I didn't even know you could go that far, but that it's called that way. We think it's an excellent, that was, you just know, all the years I was working at NATO with Afghanistan, that was seen with a strong support from India, by the way, as well. And that upset them, the Pakistanis. So that was not necessarily easy, but it was seen as one sort of lifeline and positive example and potential, even for Afghanistan, to be part of that fully, because Afghanistan has resources, has mineral resources, which could have been helpful in the economic development of the country. So it was always many countries active in the ISAF mission. So just the Silk Road as such as a potential to develop the region and to connect the regions. And by connecting them, when you find common interest for cooperation, that normally also eases the tension among countries. Yes, the ice are melting. That's why I use that as an example when some scholars keep saying, and many think tanks, the right page up and page down about Europe plays no role. Oh, Europe, the US is only focused on China. It's a bit too naive and a bit too easy to say. And there the Arctic is in fact an interesting melting pot. Yes, that's a good word by the way. I just came up with that. We work together, and it's interesting because we sit together. There's a Nordic Council, which also has an Arctic dimension where the Nordic countries meet, and you have an Arctic Council. And the Arctic Council, yes, China is an observer. Russia is now leading the Arctic Council for the next 2 years. We might have big challenges with our Russian friends, or not even partner to say, neighbors in the Baltic Sea, because they do go into our airspace without permission. They go into our waters. They send their submarines. We're not naive, and they show no respect, and they do. And you have cyber attacks that have increased dramatically towards our public functions, towards companies. It's the way it is. We're not the only country suffering. They're testing us. They're testing how far they can go. So we have difficulties, but that does not imply that we do not look for areas of cooperation, climate related, environmentally related, up in the Arctic, not the least. We work we've tried, that's been a very important principle for Sweden for many years, to avoid a strong security dimension or defense dimension in the Arctic. And Norway, NATO member, Sweden's closest neighbor, has shared that ambition to say we have to work on the high north, we have to work on education, we have to work on general economic development, but let us try to avoid making this a security, it's a defense strong area, because we'll only trigger Russian and Chinese, and they will start mobilizing, and you have sort of this, it will trigger us, too strong military mobilization. We want to avoid it for the region. It's not good for the region, but it's actually happening as we speak. So if we can have, back to the lady's question, if we can have it as a commercial passage, which enables transport, trade, and subject to the rules we will establish jointly, and taking not the least environmental concerns strongly into account, we will be discussing it. But if we see it's just to be present, to put flags on the ground, on the ocean and the ground of the ocean, and to mobilize and to start, which we've seen an arms race on the Russian side building. They're increasing their military enablers on Spitsbergen and elsewhere. Then that's a very negative development. So that discussion will go on, and we will now be watching the following 2 years now, where they have the chairmanship, how they position themselves. But when we find areas where we can talk, yes, that discussion will be going on. And that's interested, if India is interested, we have a very close bilateral relationship with India, by the way, working also on intelligence, artificial intelligence, just as one sort of area of cooperation. India.
One or two of the new members of the class here in SAIS this year have expressed to me a particular interest in Arctic matters. Maybe in the future we could be in touch and find some
And I could,
contacts
yes,
and further.
we have an ambassador working on the Arctic. I will be pleased because, of course, it's not my main focus of cooperation. It's become now because the Americans are very interested in working with us. But we have an ambassador for the Arctic issues, and she, Louise Calais, she can go into much more detail on exactly what the different areas of cooperation and what the challenges are. A lot is also about research and development. That's for us one of the key priorities now on environmental matters because of the melting of the ices, and how does that influence the whole area.
We'll follow up and we'll put students in touch.
Good.
Some questions online, but anybody in the room would like to ask another question? Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Sean. I'm from Pennsylvania. I was wondering, with regards to Afghanistan, to what extent, if at all, is the withdrawal able to be considered emblematic of an overall trend in decline of Western influence outside of Europe and the US? And to what extent does that contribute to difficulties in promoting democratic values and environmental concerns, and especially human rights and women's rights?
It's been, I'd be interested to look into the American papers. I mean, apart from that, Biden very early on, I think, decided, and the deadline had been put by the Trump administration. We are leaving, the deadline, the date was set. So there wasn't perhaps so much opportunity to look at alternative arrangements. But the question we have asked ourselves, and I cannot give you an answer, is since it's been so clear that yes, the Americans are, and they want us, of course, the same. The focus is handling China. How do we work? How do we cooperate? How, the whole pivot to Asia is partly still there, even though now under the Biden administration, Europe is seen they would wish to take us on that very trip, to work together, to have discussions together. And sometimes the criticism will be, and rightly so, that in many cases the decision is taken and Europe comes along. We haven't really been part of the decision-taking process. And that will be, if, let's say, the openness and also acceptance on the American side to sometimes adapt to European positions, that also has to come forward if you want to have a trustworthy relationship and work together. So short term, you're saving money. The Americans are saving money, and you can partly understand that keeping girls in school couldn't, continue costing the billions of dollars, not the least when the needs nationally and you don't have the political support in your country. In fact, the same in Germany or Sweden. The support to stay in Afghanistan, development-wise, yes, but perhaps not military-wise. So it's partly understandable, but as I said earlier, the way the exit was handled. But the question we put ourselves is basically what you're asking me. If the calculation was getting out of Afghanistan, we don't believe in this. It was supposed to be an anti-terrorist operation. It extended far too far. And we need the resources to keep focus sort of on Asia, pivot to Asia. If you want to reinforce your own position and say that America is back, and you put democracy promotion as one of the key elements, even partly more important than, climate change, democracy promotion, they even go hand in hand, I would say. Now you've created a situation which is read by China and by Russia as strengthening their interests. The American lost, and even losing the strongest nation in military might in the world, lose against Taliban. That is the way it's read, not by everybody, but that's sort of the headlines we've seen these past weeks. So of course you wonder how much did that calculation enter. It must have entered at some point, even though it was perhaps a decision taken early on. But you have strengthened, and Afghanistan, it's Central Asia, it's Asia. It's partly Asia. I mean, even the Silk Route dimension, which was mentioned early on. So you have actually said you will strengthen your own interests. You're back into world politics. You do not want to strengthen the Chinese sort of influence, expansion, if you want to, expansionist ambitions, nor the Russians. But this is exactly what you have done in Afghanistan, because both the Russians will extend. That's why the Russians said immediately, we'll keep the embassy. We work with the Taliban. They probably have for a long time, by the way. I see that coming up in questions in our own ministry, our Asia department asking us, but you know, how were they thinking? How did they want voluntary to surrender to Taliban and at the same time strengthening the so-called, let's say, contesters of the American agenda? And I've not seen a good answer coming up, which has to be an American answer, apart, let's say, the logical one. We've been there 20 years. It didn't change much, but the timing. Well, maybe it's an internal domestic timing. You have, you know, elections coming up. Let's say the rotten apples had to be sort of thrown out of the basket, leaving time to look at a positive agenda, which of course every president will want to have when you come to midterm elections. And Afghanistan will not be particularly positive for any country in the world. So that will be my main explanation, my own sort of assessment or conclusion drawn.
Veronika, as we're coming up to time now.
Oh, I love this. We could continue several hours.
Well,
Now look, if it's tired, I would.
Tremendous. I'd just like to relate to you a question from a student that I would embroider just a tiny bit. I mean, the student's question is really whether what we have seen in the last few weeks, whether Afghanistan or the latest story concerning this unpronounceable alliance that sounds vaguely like some strange animal or bird, AUKUS. Are these bumps in the road or are they turning points? And, you know, putting it in a historical perspective, when I think back to earlier phases, for example, in the relationship between the United States and Britain, or the United States and France in the 1950s, when we look back now, and maybe there's sort of backward projection on it, we see the 1956 Suez Crisis as having been a turning point, particularly between the UK and the United States. There's a special relationship between London and Washington was really called into question after the Suez Crisis, when the French and the British, together with the Israelis, were involved in a military operation in Egypt, and basically the US pulled the plug on this operation. And you know, some would even trace Britain's eventual application to join the EU to the disillusionment with the US stemming partly from that crisis. And when we look at the developments that we've been discussing here this evening, what's the order of magnitude of these incidents? Where are they bumps in the road? Or if we look back 20 years from now, are we going to see them as turning points?
Turning points in what sense? I think what will be interesting is actually the role of France. Because the role of France in the EU, this is for us, and I have to say that, it's for us. We might be, as I said personally, understanding the French frustration, but then yes, no, it's a military contract at the end of the day, it's a procurement contract, but it's not an EU issue. And I think the French frustration, if I allow myself to read, you know, I of course follow the debates in France quite closely, I think there's a certain French frustration that not more countries have come out in support, in solidarity of France in, let's say, the handling. Or yes, of course, it's been a how do you say,
clumsily handled.
Yes, exactly, and that they would have not been. But I think for most capitals, will take the view this is their affair. This is not an EU affair. But the EU at the same time only last week, basically the same day before or something, put forward a new strategy for the Pacific. So I think there is we have to go back to the substance. What are we doing in that region? I would, of course, perhaps claim that that's from my personal point of view. We have to clean up our own neighborhood first. We have the Balkans issues mainly not solved. We have the Caucasus kind of issues, Eastern Partnership countries not solved. We have Russia not solved. That's a closed. We have North Africa. We had the Arab Spring not so long ago. I think Europe should have its main, but this again, partly my government's view, partly a lot my own. We have to show, the EU has credibility when it can show that it can solve the problems close in the EU. We have issues in the EU, as you all know as well, and where we can stabilize the regions around us ourselves. Yes, and then we have China phenomenon. China, somebody said, if Russia is a hurricane, China is climate change. We have to prepare ourselves, not the least when the digital transformation of societies of the world goes on. We have to be capable to meet and work again, but there It's for me totally naive to think that Europe can find its own approach or reason. I think we need to work with Americans to have any kind of cloud. We're not taking serious the EU because the EU is too diverse and has too many differences amongst itself. So the best is to work two entities together and define how we address and how we work, constructively, but where limits have to be put, the limits will be put together. It has to be the same limits. So there again, think transatlantic cooperation is crucial in my view. Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And thank you for being so outspoken and clear, both on your government's behalf, but also very much being very frank and open and direct with us on your behalf. Thanks to the students, both here and online, for your questions. And here's a very small token from the school of our appreciation. Thank you so much for coming down to Bologna. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for listening. And as I said, it's now 8 o'clock in the evening. Go home now, quickly. Go out, have a drink, and hope to see you again at some point. And good luck for the future. Good luck for this academic year.
Tremendous. Thank you so much. Wonderful.